Hello and welcome to a very interesting and special episode of Rolling in Mills. Now, regular viewers of this program will note that I'm not in the regular setting that I'm normally in. I generally record in front of like a white wall with a green screen. That ain't happening because I am not in my natural state of being of Australia. I'm currently in Conegliano, Italy, of all places, which is a small kind of medieval town about 45 minutes outside of Venice by train. And it is wonderful out here, and I was actually going to shoot this episode outdoors in this vineyard, just a beautiful location, but the lighting was really inconsistent and it just didn't really work for shooting. So now I'm indoors here in a monastery from the 14th century in a film screening room, which is probably even more absurd than shooting outdoors. But regardless, I'm going to be talking about the exceedingly important film Bicycle Thieves, 1948, by Vittorio De Sica, a famed neorealist film, one of the essential entries into this subgenre of film. If you don't know what neorealism is, then I'll just give a very brief breakdown. It's basically quite a short period in Italian filmmaking after the Second World War, where Italy was basically devastated physically, economically, basically in every way. They'd suffered from fascism under Mussolini, they were occupied by the Germans briefly, generally weren't having a fantastic time, and some films that came out for about 5 years after that really reflected this kind of bleak period, this sense of realism, poverty. A lot of these neorealist films follow these kind of bleak single-person stories where these people live in horrible, poor conditions and are basically failed by every institution that they attempt to go to. Everything seems to be crumbling, and they're generally not the funnest of experiences. Fantastic films, but definitely on the more dour side of filmmaking. But not only were the films about that, there were so many techniques that were pioneered out of this era, such as far longer takes with shots, very interesting, like naturalistic editing, much looser pacing in scenes, despite the runtime of these films generally being like, hour and a half, hour 40. So it's not as if the films themselves were quite a bit longer, though there are some exceptions to that rule. And Bicycle Thieves, and actually De Sica's filmography, really reflects this neorealist period. He also directed a film called Umberto D, which is another staple of neorealism, one of the last neorealism films around 1950, and Bicycle Thieves fits really neatly into this genre. It's probably the most famous neorealist film and one of the more famous films ever made. You'll see it all the time on like sight and sound poll lists. They shoot pictures, don't they? You'll see this film pop up quite a bit because it's very important, very genre defining. So basically, to give a quick summary, this film follows the story of this very working class and quite poor man who finally is able to land a job because, of course, in Italy at the time, there were very few jobs, not a lot of income coming in for a lot of people, just a generally terrible experience. But this man finally gets this job where he can paint up posters around the city. But to do this, he has to have a bicycle, and if he doesn't have the bicycle, of course, he can't take the job. Eventually, he buys a bike. Finally, he's on the job, and immediately his bike is stolen. And the rest of the film basically follows him and his kid trying to find his bike somewhere in Italy in this huge location, and trying to find it through the help of these various different institutions, like the police, like the union that he's part of, and then eventually attempting through religion. And it's not as bleak as some other neorealist films, like particularly the films of Rossellini. They get pretty bleak. It does have a very kind of depressing and sour overtone to it, but definitely doesn't like bathe and muster in it. It's just kind of light touches along the way, and actually some pretty nice kind of comedic and more lighthearted moments in it. I gotta say, critically, I don't usually focus on acting as a positive. I don't like to talk about it that much. I generally like to talk more about the technical aspects of film, but the lead performances from this older man and this really young child actor are just mind-blowing. The kid actor in particular here is one of the best on-screen performances from a child I think I've ever seen. His line delivery is just amazing, and his facial expressions, his physical acting is just incredible generally, but for his age, he must be like 6 or 7. It's just mind-blowing, and he is so very cute. Such a cute little kid. Oh my god, just fantastic performance. And the same can be said for the father character, who's actually an untrained actor, which is another staple of neorealism. A lot of these films used non-actors, working class people that these directors would just train up and then just have them act, and you just get these really raw, unfiltered performances, and that really comes through here with this father character. He probably isn't like a standout for the majority of the times, but in the points where this film does get dramatic, and it does get quite melodramatic in parts, he is just fantastic. Just brilliant expression, especially for a non-actor. It's fantastic. And on the point of technicality, these neorealist films generally aren't the best looking, besides Paisan, which is a Roberto Rossellini film, which is just amazing. It's kind of like like a bit of a war epic. But besides that, most of these neorealist films are quite shoddily shot. They were shot when they didn't have a lot of actual physical film. Like it just really didn't exist in Italy. They were just shooting on scraps. They had basically no budget. They were shooting, outdoor scenes with unaware people there, crazy circumstances to shoot a film. So the actual aesthetics of the film, like the cinematography, like the, sound design, generally isn't the best. In saying that though, the soundtrack to this film has really, really grown on me, particularly on like a second and third viewing. It just really stood out, just this beautiful theme. And the composer of this, Alessandro Ciccognini, and I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, also did the soundtrack for Umberto D, the other famous De Sica film. And as well as that, the soundtrack for What's Eating Gilbert Grape. But it just works with this film so perfectly. It's just like this mellow kind of plodding theme. It just comes back in these really seminal, important moments in the film, and it's just used to perfection. Now, while most neorealist films don't directly address this, this film quite obviously goes into this idea of institutions failing people. Here it's very, very explicitly covered. I mean, the plot basically just focuses on central character goes to the police, and they cannot help him with finding his bike. He goes to the union and they're no help. And he goes to religion and then religion fails him, which is actually an idea that's carried on from Rossellini's Rome Open City, in which you see this priest character being slowly worn down by the turmoils of war. And it's just a fantastic piece on that. Here, the actual failure of institutions is a very literal thing. In others, you'll see, say, a poor family who have been failed by institutions like the government, police to do with crime, maybe doctors or health services where they just can't get the support they need. And of course, it's relevant to the period where basically no one was really getting help from these institutions. But it's interesting that it's so integral to the plot in this film. There's also a very similar plot like this in Umberto D. That story follows this kind of poor elderly man trying to find his dog, who he loses in this enormous city, and he just tries and tries and tries to find it through various people. And basically it's a very similar situation to the one in Bicycle Thieves, where of course this character is trying to find his bicycle. Bicycle Thieves is definitely the better film technically, though I think I prefer Umberto D. I'm not sure, I'd have to see both again though. It's actually pretty interesting. On the third time watching this film, I discovered that the writer Cesare Zavattini was actually a full-blown communist/Marxist, which totally changes the reading of this film entirely, because it kind of stops being this story about, this very, very poor worker who kind of represents all of the poor in Italy at the time, just being failed by the government, being failed by these institutions, just having this very, very bleak overtone to the film, this depression, this sadness, this economic hardship after the war. But when you read it from a Marxist perspective, it becomes this fight of the worker, the prole, fighting against this greater force and losing. Of course, someone steals the man's bike, Bicycle Thieves, which is of course a direct result of capitalism and the need to survive. And these institutions failing people perhaps would be remedied by communism? No, it actually wouldn't. Communism's complete trash. It doesn't work in any form. Stop doing communism. Communism is bad. It didn't work in Russia. It didn't work in Cambodia. It didn't really work in Vietnam. Hasn't really worked in Korea at the slightest, so it's time to stop. But regardless of that Marxist reading, the film is mainly about humanity failing itself, failing to look after its own kind, which in itself is caused by World War II, which was a failure of morality, which is a failure of humanity to not be complete cunts to each other, basically. Of course, it's far more complex than that, politically, geographically, so on and so forth, as to the reasons why World War II happened. But in terms of this film thematically, it's mainly just about the failure of humanity to look after its own kind, and for societies to attempt to not implode by not helping their own citizens. Okay, so I'm going to briefly go into spoilers here. If you want to avoid that, click here, and this will take you to a little section, my conclusion, after spoilers. So like I was saying a bit earlier, this film's kind of about a failure of humanity on itself, and also on the point of the failure of these institutions. The final scene of this film is this main character who is just so reduced. He's run out of all options. He's going to basically starve if he can't have his bike. Very early on in the film, he has to sell, his bed sheets to pay for this bike that he'd already, pawned off. And he will be left with absolutely nothing now. Everyone has failed him. And the final scene is that he tries to steal a bike from someone else and then is just immediately caught doing so, but let off the hook after the owner of the bike sees that he has a little kid. And the very, very famous last shot of this film is the father and the boy just, walking off with this mass of humanity, into the sunset. But it has such a different connotation than basically every other end walk off into the sunset film, because it's so bleak. It's just this idea of the future being completely unknown. And it's not only unknown to the characters, it's unknown to us because of course the film ends at this point and we have no idea what happens to these characters. Presumably it's not going to be fantastic, and I think that's kind of the point. Basically you're reading on the behalf of Italy saying, well, we don't know what's going to happen now. We're in this terrible situation. Everyone's miserable. Everything's very bleak, and we're just going forward. And it's just this aura of uncertainty. And I really, really love the way it's handled. On top of that, it's an interesting, like, reverse character arc where this kind of good, hardworking, noble person is reduced to theft, which is of course what he initially was suffering from the beginning of the plot. Or it's this very cyclical kind of sickness in humanity where perhaps the person who stole his bike actually had something of theirs stolen and they had to do that to survive. And it's just the poor feeding off the poor. And yet again, institutions have failed the people and they're just squabbling among themselves, and it isn't their fault is definitely the thing. You of course feel very, very sympathetic to this character because you followed him. He was a hard-working guy, he has a kid, he has a wife, and just out of nowhere his bike's stolen, he's failed by everyone, and he has to resort to this theft. And then everyone else there just treats him like trash, basically, except, of course, the owner of the bike who lets him off, which is kind of the only merciful thing that anyone in the entire film does. But I just love that kind of moral conundrum that comes up for this character. It's great putting good and noble characters in just these horrible, horrible circumstances. And I think I was mentioning Rome Open City before, the priest character who is just forced into this war-torn city. You see it a bit in Germany Year Zero, where this very, very poor German boy is forced into this terrible situation and he has to, change his morality to kind of survive. It's just a perfect setup and it's just handled wonderfully here. On a general note, I just love the pacing and tone of this film. Like I was mentioning earlier, neorealism as a movement kind of pioneered the way for very poetic, naturalistic editing, though it wasn't very, very strong here. Definitely started like watering down and disintegrating those boundaries, which would then later be reflected in someone like Tarkovsky's work, where his films are almost like visual poems in terms of their flow. They're so natural. He talks about this a lot in his book Sculpting in Time, where he discusses this like internal time logic within scenes where it just is so natural and so flowing, and almost like the way in which a conversation flows. And if you ever listen to editors talking about editing films, they kind of talk about like feeling like the beat and the rhythm of the scene. And I think his films, and definitely neorealism, really reflect that. And if you want to see an even further example of that, look at Bela Tarr's films. His films are just so drawn out and long. They have extremely long shot lengths and they just cover just the bleakest, most depressing stuff. And you're just forced to, sit with these shots, and it's just so interesting to see it as an influence just evolve throughout the years with these brilliant filmmakers. Tarkovsky and Tarr are just immaculate in their construction, particularly Tarkovsky though. In saying that, I'm not absolutely head over heels for this film. I think I see the importance more of it than I actually enjoy it. Of course, it's still a fantastic film and I give it quite a high score, but in saying that, it's not like cream of the crop. For me, it's quite simple and procedural. As I batted you over the head with this institution failing stuff, it is very much like, we need to go to the police to find my bike. That fails. We need to go to such and such to do this. That fails. Such and such and such. And it's very, very simple in the way it's constructed. And simple is fine and it's handled very, very well. But I don't feel like it does anything extremely thematic or in depth with that. And I think that just comes down to the sort of film it is. I mean, it's almost perfect for what it tries to do, but I think that kind of has a ratings cap. Of course, the main thing about this film is that it's exceedingly important. I think I kind of have the same opinion about this as I do with something like Vertigo or Citizen Kane, which are ranked as, some of the best films ever made, if not the best films ever made. But quality-wise, I wouldn't even consider them in like my top 50 even, because, that's just a subjective taste thing. They're obviously extremely important and definitely influential to cinema, but in terms of overall enjoyment, in terms of what they do, I just don't see them as the best films quality-wise, objectively, that I've seen. That's basically my opinion on those films, and then Bicycle Thieves as well, which is why I give this an 88 out of 100, which is still a very, very high score. It just isn't in that, cream of the crop, like 95 plus tier. So those are my thoughts on this. You can find my other reviews down here. Particularly did a video on Bela Tarr, who I was briefly mentioning before. I mentioned some stuff about neorealism there, and I kind of expand on what I was talking about briefly in this video. You can also find the review for Rossellini's Rome Open City down there, which is the first film in his very, very famous and neorealist war trilogy, and it's just a brilliant, brilliant film. I referenced it several times in this video, and I'd highly recommend checking that out. And ciao.